So, thank you very much. Now we have Ville-Pekka Sorsa from the University of Helsinki. Ville, please.
Okay, good morning to everyone on my behalf, and I too would like to join in and thank the organizers for the opportunity to participate in this wonderful symposium. Okay, so as yesterday's speakers showed us, pandemic emergencies produce quite challenging circumstances for democratic politics and policy making. And in my presentation, I will zoom in on one challenge that the pandemic emergency conditions raise for democracies. So many scholars have warned us that emergency politics have authoritarian tendencies that can undermine citizen rights and democracy in the longer run. And COVID showed us that even the strongest democracies were not shielded from these tendencies, as unlawful emergencies occurred in numerous countries. And many pandemic control policies also compromised basic rights without clear legal or constitutional justification. And we also saw that based on the VDEM research that democratic backsliding accelerated during the pandemic. But then again, COVID also showed us that some democratic countries did not adopt authoritarian measures that unlawfully compromise basic rights, or they did not adopt autocratic modes of governing that would have compromised democracy. Now, why is that? This is how I see it. There are strong pull factors towards authoritarianism in pandemic conditions. So if there is a push towards authoritarian politics, then citizen attitudes, emergency-style politics, and crisis management-style decision-making will amplify and prolong this push, and this is what I call the authoritarian bandwagon effect. So if there is no push towards authoritarianism, which was the case in some countries during COVID, we do not need to worry about the bandwagon effect at all. But I think authoritarian impulses will emerge in the emergencies of the future. And if we want to safeguard basic rights and democracy in future pandemics, then we need to address these pull factors as well. So in my presentation, I will present some anecdotal and emerging research findings on the COVID experience that are relevant for understanding the bandwagon effect. We often overlook such anecdotal evidence, but I think it really already provides us some clues that the bandwagon effect can be alleviated, and thus it deserves to be discussed. But for the reason of this research being still quite anecdotal, I decided to do the academic thing that everybody loves, that is to present long texts and include references on my slides. So I'm doing exactly everything I tell my students not to do. So, yeah. Okay, so pre-COVID research already showed us that citizen attitudes, political dynamics, and crisis management settings are important enablers of authoritarianism under pandemic emergencies. Scare and anxiety usually generate popular demands for strict control policies, and such demands typically persist until the so-called pandemic fatigue hits. Now, demands for measures that clearly violate basic rights, basic citizen rights, are not necessarily that common. The point is that the crowd easily joins in them. And pre-COVID research showed that authoritarian attitudes may swiftly translate into loud support for strict policy measures. So political responses to popular demands are likely to favor the stricter demands. The pandemic is usually framed as a national security issue, and this is what Dr. Ramakrishnan touched upon the issue on Thursday already. Policymakers may want to show with hard action that they are taking both the security threat and popular demands very seriously to demonstrate leadership. And this often leads to unlawful measures. Well, for reasons I will not go into more detail here, media also plays a role in hardening the citizen attitudes and pushing for ever harder political responses, but that's too long a story to tell here, but this observation exists. Anyway, for these reasons, early pandemic control is likely to be based on quite stringent measures and often unlawful actions. But these measures may also be difficult to abandon as the pandemic proceeds due to the crisis management mode of governance that is typical to health emergencies. Many scholars have for long argued that ideas and policies adopted early on in a pandemic are likely to become very path-dependent in this kind of mode of governance. Now, while all these insights are highly relevant for the COVID experience too, I think that research on COVID has somewhat also challenged these views. Now, starting with citizen attitudes, research first of all suggests that the general attitudes on authoritarianism and democracy and specific attitudes on pandemic control do not go hand in hand. In fact, many contradictions seem to exist. There might be an opposite relations. Those favoring more authoritarian views may have actually been very much against strict pandemic control policies. It seems that individual framings of the problems that people face in pandemics seem to be much more important than general attitudes in defining their policy stances. But it also seems that identification with in-group elites largely shape these framings. So if there is a bandwagon, it is more driven by in-group elites than general attitudes that people have. One might then come into the conclusion that the politically polarized post-truth world of social media is really a big problem here. But there is some anecdotal evidence from a few countries that suggests that increased following of social media was actually quite helpful in improving adherence to softer recommendations. And in fact, increased social media as well as legacy media consumption has been observed to lead to improved adherence. In this sense, the media may have actually helped individuals to adopt framings that decrease demands for draconian responses. So we may have to think about the role of media a bit. Now, moving to political responsiveness, I think the crucial observation here is that popular perceptions of government performance seem to be based not so much on the overall handling of the pandemic, but the early response to the pandemic, and especially its legitimization. So this may in part explain why so many democratic governments and political parties have struggled so much with their popularity after the COVID experience, even when they have been able to argue that they performed actually pretty well. So it may be true that democracies performed better than autocracies in handling the pandemic if we include the recovery period in analysis. But for citizen attitudes, this does not seem to matter that much. So another important observation here is that preparedness does not guarantee democratic responses or positive popular perceptions. Some research suggests that countries with higher degrees of preparedness and governance capacity, in fact, reacted to the pandemic the slowest. So this led to improvised responses without a clear legitimization strategy, which in turn led to popular mistrust and in many cases also the improvisation via unlawful emergencies. Finally, looking at the crisis management mode of governing, it seems that the path dependency of early responses may be much broader and stronger than previously suggested. So the justifications adopted by leading policymakers early on in the pandemic proved very elastic. They continued along those lines for a very long time. And one reason behind this is that media discourses in a few countries that have been studied were very monotonous. They provided mainly room for the early legitimizations adopted by governments, so they maintained those legitimizations for a long time. And in some countries, public health authorities also very actively sought to maintain their early strategies and legitimization strategies especially. And by the way, the Swedish experience of COVID that Marta Paterlini discussed yesterday seems to be very relevant for all these points. So, based on these observations, what could we possibly do to alleviate the authoritarian bandwagon effects in future pandemics? I think that the one thing we can do is to focus on early responses, and especially the emergency governance, legitimization, and communication aspects of it. So one could say that it is more important to prepare for pandemic governance and its communication than for any specific policy measure or policy response if we want to prevent the bandwagon effects. And I think Alexander Phelan's remarks for yesterday were spot on in this respect. The cycle of neglect and panic improvisation seems very dangerous. So perhaps we need some kind of better preparedness for the emergency, for the governance aspects of emergency. Well, anyway, communication in the early response is the crucial factor in shaping citizen attitudes and the media landscape. So we need to reach these in-group elites and manage media expectations if we want to influence citizen attitudes. And perhaps here we shouldn't be that afraid of multiple framings, you know. We often insist, and we've heard it many times during the symposium here as well, that we need a clear message, like the Japanese 3C strategy, which was amazing. I really like that. This may be very important in the very early stages to have the clear message, but as the pandemic proceeds, it seems that we only insist upon very narrow framings. And if it is the individuals who construct the problems, they might become very suspicious towards those simple framings. So I think multiple framings are needed if we want to make the path dependencies of crisis management less pressing. Perhaps we need to embrace that. And this is also something that relates to George's conundrums here. Perhaps it's not the simplest message that always is the most helpful. Well, of course, any policy response is very difficult to legitimize without trust in policymakers, crisis managers, and public health authorities. And or for that matter, any research on COVID probably has no silver bullets to offer on how to increase that trust. But luckily, our next two speakers may have more to say about that. Okay, so I'll end with this words, and thank you very much.